not to make a pun or anything, but I'm very happy that you're all here, and I'd like to just get the course started. And I'll start with a parable, and I'm afraid it's not as profound as anything by Plato or dignified as anything you might find in the New Testament, but it's a story that was told to me by a friend of mine. We were talking about the pursuit of happiness, and he said, well, there was this guy in Florida, I believe he was arrested in Florida, for breaking and entering into houses. And what he would do is he'd wait till people were away on vacations and things like that for a while. Then he'd break into their houses and he'd eat all their food, and then he would, I'm sorry to say this, he would urinate in their refrigerators, and he would defecate in their beds and things like that. And when they finally captured him after he had done this to quite a large number of people, they asked him why he did this. And he said, well, I was hungry. That's why he ate. And, well, why did you go to the bathroom in people's beds? And, well, I had to go. And I was sitting there sort of aghast, looking at my dinner, which was less and less appetizing as the story progressed. And I said, what is the moral of the story? And he said, well, people pursue happiness in different ways. And I just wanted to smack him. But the story points out a problem faced by any philosopher who wants to argue that human beings pursue happiness. And before we can talk about how to pursue it, we really have to establish that people pursue it. And then once we establish that they pursue it, it's a reasonable question to say, well, even if they do pursue it, ought they to pursue it? And I want to start out by just raising the question, is it really true that human beings pursue happiness? Because if it isn't, then the course seems to be sort of a waste of time, right? It's not something that we do. We might as well take a course on flying with flapping our arms or something. If you don't do it, then there's no point in trying to refine it by studying it more carefully. The person who's most famous for arguing that all human beings pursue happiness is Socrates. I want to start out with the Socratic argument. Socrates claimed that all men pursue happiness. Most specifically, he said that we're all searching for the good, and when you finally find out what the good is, he says, well, it's happiness or well-being. The Greek word is eudaimonia. This is a very strange claim that all human beings choose the good. All human beings are pursuing the good. What about the guy who was arrested in Florida? Is he really pursuing the good? He seems to be pursuing it in a very strange way. Well, Socrates actually has a good argument for this, and I just want to take you through it. And the argument is based on this observation. In any given situation, we always have a certain range of options, sometimes very, very few options, but we do have options, and we do have the freedom to choose one option or another. Given that we always have some options, and given the freedom to choose among those options, human beings will always choose the option that seems to them the best. So by the very nature of human choice and human action, there's a directedness towards what is regarded as good. Human beings are pursuing the good in all things. And if that's the case, that we're all pursuing the good, and ultimately he'll argue it's happiness, then the only choice, if Socrates is right, is how we pursue the good, whether to pursue it intelligently or not. And this course is really for people who wish to pursue it intelligently. No thought is required to pursue it stupidly, and no class is required. But if you want to pursue it intelligently, then, of course, we have to think about it carefully. And the best place to go to think about this are great thinkers who have already worked through these things before and have left us records of their thoughts, and that's the purpose of the course, to survey some very eloquent and persuasive exponents of different conceptions of what the good life is or what happiness is. Again, let's go back to the Socratic argument, though. The idea that we always choose the best option available is the basis for his claim that all action is oriented towards the good. But what about the guy in Florida, and what about Jeffrey Dahmer? These are the sorts of questions we have to ask. These people were highly motivated in doing things that most of us would regard as bad or gross or evil. How would Socrates handle those kinds of examples? Well, you have to really put a lot of weight on this proviso as we see it. All human beings choose the good as they see it from the options that are available to them. Because if we object to Jeffrey Dahmer's decisions, Socrates would say it's because we think that they're simply mistaken about where they see the good. Jeffrey Dahmer could have spent his evenings visiting sick people, or going to the movies, or going to the library, or reading to improve his mind, but instead he lured people back to his apartment, killed them, and cut them up and ate them. Why? Because of all the options available, as he saw it, that was the best use of his time. Now, again, he was gravely mistaken about that, according to Socrates, but still the structure of his action was oriented towards the good as he saw it. And the corollary of this claim that we're always orienting our actions towards the good as we see it is this: nobody chooses evil as such, meaning nobody purposefully does something that they regard as evil. People only choose evil under the guise of choosing the good, right, or under the guise of the good, and they're mistaken about what the good is, and they end up choosing something not good or positively ungood or evil. Now, this all sounds terribly utopian and optimistic and Pollyanna-ish, I guess, to some people. But actually, the arguments can be made to work. And I think that if we can make this work, then we are a long ways toward establishing a justification for the course. Because if Socrates is right and we're all pursuing the good in all of our actions, and the good is ultimately to be understood as our happiness, then we can set that aside and then raise the next question: well, ought we do this? And if we ought, then how? What's the right path? Socrates really does claim that evil is simply an ignorance of the good. When you talk about people being virtuous, all that virtue boils down to is a kind of knowledge of the good, how to do the right thing in particular places and times. The virtue of courage is a kind of knowledge of when to fight and when to run away, and when not to fight, when to hold oneself back. The vice of cowardice is a lack of knowledge, in the sense it's a lack of knowledge of when it's appropriate to stand one's ground. And to the coward, a bad act appears as the best option, namely running away when he shouldn't. And so for Plato, and this is true for Aristotle, for Socrates, for most of the ancient Greeks, vice is a kind of derangement of the mind. They believe that the intellect has a capacity not only to weigh questions of truth or falsehood, but that the human soul has a capacity to perceive the good. However, that capacity can be just deranged and diluted and clouded by all kinds of factors. And vice is just the global term they give to a clouding of our moral sensibilities, so that things that aren't good show up as good, and things that are good show up as bad or not choice-worthy or outright evil. One question you can raise about this, I suppose, is the question: on this account, are evil people morally culpable? Right? If people choose the evil, they meant well, right? We all mean well. That's one way of putting it. We all mean well. And if we all mean well, are people who choose to do very bad things culpable if they mean well? For the Greeks, that wasn't a problem. Of course we're culpable if we choose bad things. Why? Because there's a sense that we're obligated to know the truth about what's right and wrong. There's a basic expectation that human beings will familiarize themselves with the good and the bad. We'll, first of all, exercise our faculties to perceive goodness and badness, cultivate our ability to see what's good and bad. And also there's a presumption that it's wrong for us to derange our faculties, distort our faculties, or just let them lie fallow and get rusty. One of the claims that you will find with people like Aristotle, for instance, is that oftentimes people who can't see the good anymore, can't see the good because of their own habituation. They habituate themselves in certain ways to seeing and acting perversely. For example, Ted Bundy is a good example of somebody who, through really deliberate activities, came to habituate himself to being evil and vicious. When he tells his whole story, and of course it was Ted Bundy, probably in a plea for some kind of sociological or psychological excuse for his behavior, talked about how when he was young he would look at violent pornography and read about sadistic behaviors and things like this, and that eventually this corrupted his faculties, so he would see these things as positively good. He came to appreciate cruelty and sadism. Why? Because he applied himself to the task. But at the beginning of the process, he was clearly exercising certain choices. Because he was exercising choice, he's culpable for the outcome, even though at the end of the process he may no longer have been in control of his actions, in some deep sense. Okay? He might have become less than a human agent. He might have brutalized or bestialized himself. Aristotle talks about how below evil there's what he calls bestiality, which is just human beings who are so deeply corrupted in their sensibilities that they can no longer be redeemed or control themselves or exercise any kind of moral agency. Everything that we pursue under the guise that it's the best thing that we can do with our time. Now, are there questions about the argument? I mean, the basic claim. For Plato, we're always pursuing the good. Those who pursue evil do it out of ignorance. And that's the explanation. If you dislike or disagree with some people's behavior, Plato or Socrates would say, you shouldn't say that these people are choosing the bad or choosing evil as such. What you really disagree with is their evaluation of what is good, because no one chooses things under the guise of evil, they only choose it under the guise of good. So the assumption here, and this is a deep sort of metaphysical assumption that underlies this argument, is that there's a right and wrong answer about what the good is. Because if you can be mistaken about the good, that means that you can be right, and that means there's some kind of objective standard of what constitutes goodness that underlies this whole argument. So, are you all pursuing the good? Is this the best use of your time that you could see for this evening? The point is that for Socrates, moral issues are unavoidable, because the very structure of human action directs us towards the good and away from the bad, and that means that we need to be able to discriminate between the two. Discrimination requires standards or criteria. If the basic argument is clear, again, we just need to remind ourselves, or I'll just remind you, the underlying assumption is that there's a right and wrong answer here. That there are criteria, there are questions of truth and falsehood that apply, and then the next question is, well, where do you find these criteria, which was asked. And, well, for Plato and for Socrates and the other Greeks, the criteria are found in nature, ultimately. There's this phrase, what's right by nature, that's absolutely central to the ancient Greek philosophers. Well, at least after Socrates, post-Socratic philosophy is all entirely oriented around the idea that there's a right answer by nature, and then the question is, well, how do we discover it? Well, the way you discover anything else is by nature, by observation, by application. And the Greeks were very, very fond of using, if you will, physical analogies to illustrate issues having to do with the soul. And Plato and Socrates define goodness, virtue, as health in the soul, and vice as a kind of sickness of the soul. And the question then becomes, well, how do you discover what the sickness and the health of the soul is? Well, why don't we look to how doctors understand what sickness and health of the body is? There's clearly a normative dimension to the notion of health in medicine. 98.6 is held up as a kind of norm for normal temperature, and some people quibble about that now. But there are certain normative dimensions to what constitutes health. How have we discovered this? By looking at how organisms flourish and how they suffer. And the same sort of answers can be given in ethics by the same kind of observation of what makes the flow of the soul healthy and flourish and what makes it sick. So the answer is ultimately a kind of empirical issue. There are no authorities. The only authority, if you will, is nature itself, and nature is available to us all through study. And so that's how we come to know these norms. The next topic I want to talk about is relativism. Moral relativism is the most widespread belief about ethics in our culture today, I would say. I'm constantly surprised at the kinds of people who turn out to be moral relativists. I've encountered fundamentalist Christians who believe in the revealed absolute truth and the infallibility of the Bible, and who turn out to be soft, squishy moral relativists when you raise questions about how do you justify that. Well, I just choose to believe this, or something like that. So what is moral relativism, and why should we even be concerned with it? Well, moral relativism is of great concern because if moral relativism is true, you can all go home, because this course can't benefit you. Now, why do I say that? Well, I say that for this reason. Relativism is basically this idea that in the pursuit of happiness, or the pursuit of the good, let's just use the good right now, in the pursuit of the good, there are no right or wrong answers. Each individual has the sovereign authority to set norms for him or herself, and you can't be wrong about these norms. So if you want to declare that something is good for you, you have the sovereign power to declare that that is good for you. Now, there are other kinds of relativism. cultural relativism widens the group and says that what we do around here is the good. Why? Because, well, we choose to do these things around here. Local norms are simply accepted as infallible by the sovereign will of the people, if you will. Relativism, again, if it's true, means that the class is a waste of time because what it does is it basically says that the intelligent pursuit of happiness or the thoughtful pursuit of happiness is no better than the stupid or mindless pursuit of happiness because all answers basically have an equal claim to plausibility. So you don't have to work very hard. In other words, you can be very, very passive and be secure in your passivity that no one can challenge the choice that you've made. If relativism basically is the view that human beings can decide arbitrarily, if they will, that one thing is good and one thing is evil, and they can do this for themselves, and they can't be wrong, then if we're pursuing happiness, what would the likely outcome be if relativism were true? What would the outcome of the pursuit of happiness be if moral relativism were true? Everyone would be happy, right? If relativism is the truth about the pursuit of happiness, and that truth is this: each individual gets to decide what makes him or her happy, and they cannot be wrong. That view, if it's true, would lead us to think that in the pursuit of happiness, everybody would be happy. Why? Well, basically relativism would be the claim that when it comes to the game of life, that each person gets to make up the rules as they go along. If you and I were playing a game of cards, and you had the power to change the rules at any point, you would almost necessarily win unless you just didn't care about it, right? Because no matter what card I would put down, you could say, well, in the previous hand, that would have been a winning hand, but this is the fourth hand, and so all the rules are reversed. And I'd say, okay, take my money, and then we keep playing, and you'd keep changing the rules, and you'd come out a winner. Well, if the relativist is right about morals, and the strong claim is that individuals get to decide what's right for them, then the question is, why in the world would there be anybody who's unhappy? What's your excuse for losing the stacked game of life? There would be no excuse, and it would be an extraordinarily odd thing to find anybody who's unhappy if they can define the good for them, and no one can say that they're wrong. The fact is that many people, maybe most people, really aren't happy with their lives. I'm not 100% happy with my life. And why is that? If I can define whatever I'm doing as I'm doing it as the good, then I should be completely happy at every moment. But I don't have that power, apparently. If you take the questions of morality seriously, you're going to have to assume that there's a truth or a falsehood about it. Why? Because if there's no truth or falsehood about it, then you can't really fail. And if you can't really fail, then it's not a very important game to play. It's like in Alice in Wonderland, Alice looks up to the Cheshire Cat and says, I'm lost. And the cat says, well, where were you going? And she says, I don't know. And he says, well, maybe you've gotten there then. How do you know you're lost? If there's no standard, and there's no possibility of being wrong, then you don't have to worry. You might have already arrived. If, however, there's a possibility of truth and a possibility of error in this thing, then it becomes a serious game because the stakes you're playing with are your life, right? One has to take into account human individuality in the pursuit of happiness. There's no question about it. There might not be a one-size-fits-all off-the-rack life because we all have different bodies. We don't all buy same-size suits and things like that. We don't have the same jobs and the same lives and so forth in the details. But the issue is this. When we start looking at ourselves and try and find the route to happiness that is appropriate to ourselves, aren't we treating our nature as an individual as normative? Here's one possibility that I'm convinced of as a truth, and this is the Greek view. The Greeks had this the Greek word for happiness is eudaimonia. At the root of it, well, there's a prefix eu, which means well, and daimon. It means something like an angel, and get right down to it. What does it mean to be eudaimon, right, to be happy or to attain well-being? Well, it literally means having a good spirit or a good soul or a good angel. Now, what is this angel? For the Greeks, daimonia were these quasi-divine beings that existed between heaven and earth and partook both of the mortal nature, human nature, and also the nature of the gods. And the heroes were daimons. Why? Because they were usually the offspring of mortals and gods. There were little messengers between earth and heaven, things like nymphs and sprites and things like that. We're not quite gods and not quite human. We're considered daimonia. Okay, well, what does this have to do with the pursuit of happiness, all this folklore? Well, the idea is this, that each human being has their daimon, and the daimon is sort of figuratively represented as a kind of guardian angel or spirit. But you look at Greek literature, writers like Pindar and others, there's an identification between the daimon and one's own true nature. So one's true nature or one's true self becomes one's guiding angel or guiding spirit. Now, what is it guiding you towards? Well, it's guiding you towards becoming your true self. Yourself as you might be, your ideal and fully actualized self. Not so much higher or lower, but more fully real in some sense. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means this. We all have certain potentialities, and many of us don't actualize them. But it was discovered early on that if you have certain potentialities, actualizing and living in accordance with those potentialities produces a sense of well-being and happiness. Whereas if you lead a life that does not actualize your potentialities or overtaxes them, then you live a life of tension and misery and suffering. Schopenhauer, who was a great believer in this view, Arthur Schopenhauer, the 19th century German pessimist, has a marvelous essay called Transcendent Speculations on the Apparent Deliberateness of Human Life, which is the daimon theory. Basically saying, isn't it strange that people seem to have a destiny that they fulfill in life? And what is this destiny? Well, the destiny is their character. And if you look at Heraclitus, he makes the claim, well, our daimon is our destiny. Napoleon believed that too, that character is destiny. And that the unfolding of a person's life seems to have a kind of order and necessity to it because it's guided by certain objectively existing potentialities which are striving to actualize themselves over time. And so eudaimonia really means, in a sense, well-being, but specifically well-being yourself. Or becoming yourself, becoming who you are. That's a sense of what happiness is. Self-actualization is the term that is used in psychology. What that means is that there is both an objective standard for judging your choices, but it's a totally individualized standard at the same time. And the meaningfulness, if you will, of relativism in the radical individualist sense is that it takes into account that people are completely individuated, that we're all unique. But what was bad about that is that it takes our uniqueness as, in a sense, and treats us like we're gods, in a sense, that we have the sovereign power to decide what's good or bad as individuals for ourselves. That isn't really true. And the clearest example of that is that there are so many unhappy individuals. And one of the most unhappy individuals I've ever known was a person who has spent all of his life fighting against his own daimon. He is by nature a very introspective and melancholic personality, and he has tried to make himself into a salesman, a go-getter, okay? And he gets books and listens to tapes by this guy, Tony Robbins, who is basically just a pop cut-rate Nietzschean, because Nietzsche teaches that the self is just a construction, that we can make ourselves whoever we want to be. And that's Tony Robbins' message, too. And this poor guy, just crazed by greed, has decided that he wants to be rich, and that means he's got to be a good salesman, and that means he's got to follow Tony Robbins. And the only trouble is that his soul just isn't in it. Well, that's not a problem, though, because by following Tony Robbins' advice, he's reprogramming himself. He's using the power of positive thinking to become a different human being. And the result has been years of depression. Why? Because he's been betraying himself. I think the deepest cause of depression is anxiety. And the most profound depressions are anxieties about very important issues. And the most important issue morally comes down to the question of being true to yourself or betraying yourself. And what this guy has is he's turned his guardian angel into an avenging demon, in a sense, because he's coming to realize that the only choice he has is to be himself. You don't have any option to be anybody other than who you are. But you do have a choice in this sense. You can do that, you can give into it, you can embrace your destiny and become who you are and be happy, which is what happiness is in this classical sense, eudaimonia, or you can fight it kicking and screaming at every step, fight yourself, and you'll be miserable. But that's really the only choice. Otherwise, you become who you are. You just become a miserable or a happy version of yourself, but you're still you. And everything else is just pretense and fakery. The soul consists, for Plato, of our faculties of desire, our faculty of reason, and our capacity to respond to values and ideals. It also would include the strivings towards love, strivings towards completion, desires or longings even for the immortality of the soul, life after death. So it's that part of the human being that encompasses all these strivings and desires. It's a collection of faculties, if you will. They're not merely physical. Not just the mind, in the sense of intellect. Plato locates the soul throughout the body, right? It's not just in the head. Reason is identified with the head. The spirited part of the soul that responds to values and is the locus of our sense of pride and worth is located in the chest. And the desires are located at the midriff and below. And there's some physiological logic to that if you think about just physical responses. I mean, when you think a lot, your head gets tired. That's, you said I look drained. Well, I've been thinking a lot recently. The question is, pursuing the good makes you happy. Well, I mean, it does sort of anticipate, because there are all kinds of questions that arise. I mean, some people would argue that pursuing the good doesn't make you happy, but getting it does, right? Having it is what makes you happy. Socrates and Plato seem to have the view that you don't even necessarily have to have any external goods in order to be happy, and that the faculties and capacities to pursue the good, namely a well-ordered soul and so forth, virtue, seems to be all the good one really needs, even if one never has any way of exercising it. So a person can be perfectly happy with the virtues of wisdom and courage and self-control and things like that, even if they don't have many opportunities to exercise those virtues. And so these are differences amongst the Greeks. Aristotle clearly believes that you need to have certain external equipment and a certain range of freedom of action to exercise your virtues in order to be happy. Whereas Plato doesn't seem to believe that. Certainly Socrates didn't. And the Stoics followed Socrates very closely and argued that all one needs really is a well-ordered soul. There are real questions about this, but that sort of anticipates a bit. But we'll have ample opportunity to debate these things, because we're going to look at Plato, we're going to look at the Stoics, and we're going to look at people who have a more Aristotelian view. So we'll get all the options out on the table. Well, the issue of comfort is a really important issue. First of all, the claim that all men seek comfort is false. If people sought comfort, the Marine Corps would have greater problems recruiting people than it does. And of all the branches in the armed service, it's the one without any recruitment problems. Why? Because it's hardest. And that's what's more attractive about it than the other branches. So people don't seek comfort. Nietzsche put it this way. He said, mankind doesn't seek comfort, only the English do. Okay? Actually, he used the word. Yeah. A lot of people will claim that human beings are seeking comfort. It's not empirically true, but many people do. Why? Because they think this is the best way of living. If they thought that a hard and rigorous and challenging life was the best life, then they wouldn't seek comfort, they'd seek challenges. They'd be mountain climbers. Think of The Princess and the Pea, right? You know, there's this mountain of mattresses, and there's that little pea underneath. And the comfort seeker, if they feel that little pea underneath, they're going to say, well, this is bad. This has got to go. So badness just becomes discomfort, goodness comfort, right? And that's the guise under which the pursuit of the good and the avoidance of the bad show up to certain kinds of people. Whereas there are other types who are more, more masculine types, in a traditional sense of the term, who seek challenges rather than comfort. And to them, comfort is the guise under which badness shows up. The worship of comfort is, in a sense, fleeing from hardness. And one of the hardest things to do is make moral judgments and talk about things in terms of good or bad. And sometimes people feel uncomfortable with people who are judgmental. But the fact of the matter is that they themselves have fallen into the very evil that they try to avoid, because aren't they saying that non-judgmental people are better than judgmental people? And hasn't the pursuit of the good and the avoidance of the bad cropped up again, even under the guise of avoiding tension? Well, let me just say something really quick about this, because it's sort of off the subject. Political correctness is, in a sense, morality's revenge on people who are primarily relativistic. Generally is something that you find on college campuses and among the professoria, who, for the most part, are extremely relativistic if you ask them about their moral views, and yet at the same time they manage somehow to have gotten maneuvered around into becoming fire-breathing moralists on certain issues. And how is that the case? Well, the fact is it's just, Horace said, you can drive nature out with pitchfork, but it always sneaks back in. If it's true that we have this nature which is always oriented towards pursuing goods and avoiding bads, and we're always constantly making moral discriminations, then even the people who most resolutely deny this will end up doing it. But they end up doing it in bad faith, and they end up doing it unintelligently. And the clearest sign of unintelligent moralism is moral fanaticism. Because intelligence is the power of discrimination, okay, of finding differences. Whereas fanaticism has everything to do with seeing everything in very simple terms, not making any distinctions, not being very prudent, and often being very rash. And so the kind of moralistic fanaticism that you find amongst the politically correct is simply their moral nature exercising itself against their own philosophical convictions and exercising itself with a fanatical and unintelligent vengeance. So but enough about that. I want to get back into the issue of relativism because I want to attack it, destroy it. We'll sweep up the remains and then we'll rearrange the room. Relativism? Well, it's just always been around. It's as old as youth itself. It tends to be the systematization of the youthful attitude that whatever is me is good. This one student I had said to me that he thought that my view on this boiled down to the view of his Marine drill sergeant. I thought, oh God, what is this? And he said, opinions are like assholes. Everybody has one. Well, it's not very refined, but the point is clear. The point is that what relativism is the claim that there are simply opinions about the good, that there's no truth or falsehood. Now, opinions aren't like assholes in the sense that everyone has an infinite number of them, potentially, and you can always change them. And they're not very important in the sense that they can always be changed. And so the point is that if you have to start accommodating yourself to the existence of others, since your opinions aren't that important, it's easy enough to be sort of accommodating about these things. This is the liberal relativist view. If there are no values, we should all be kind and gentle to one another because there's nothing so important as to get anybody upset about or uncomfortable about. Relatively speaking, they were both right. I mean, it's saying, look, there's lion morality and antelope morality. Well, we'd have to ask the lion or the antelope. I mean, they're the ultimate authorities. But again, human beings are different than nature because we have this amazing capacity to generate opinions. The amazing fluidity and variability of the contents of the human mind is extraordinary compared to the behavior patterns of animals, which tend to be very regular from time to time and place to place. And what is this amazingly fluid and protean content of the mind but opinion? Opinions are things that set us apart from the rest of the world. The relativist says that the good is a matter of opinion. Well, I just think we have to make a distinction here between what you're talking about and what I'm talking about. And when I talk about relativism, I mean philosophical thesis about the nature of values and the world, which is different from the kind of, if you will, methodologic. In the social sciences, there's the idea that you can treat cultures as wholes and you can understand. You have to see things through the eyes of the people in that culture in order to understand what they're saying. And so there's a relativity of their worldview or their claims to the particular context in which they live. Now that's a purely descriptive claim. Okay, and it's completely correct. You can't understand what somebody in Afghanistan means unless you, when they say something to you, unless you know what the cultural context is, what the language means, and so on and so forth. That's a purely factual issue. It's a way of how you study cultures, but it doesn't deal with normative questions about what's right and wrong. It deals with what people think is right, but it doesn't necessarily deal with what really is. And what relativism in the philosophical sense really is a claim about really difficult normative questions about how to determine what's true or false. And the argument is, when it comes to values, that either individuals or cultures as a whole can determine this in a simple way by sort of fiat, if you will, by convention, and that they can't be claimed to be wrong. Whereas I would say this, that you can be completely correct about how to study different cultures and their value systems and so forth, but you have to understand that what this has is the status of opinion, and that it might be possible for the Afghans to be terribly mistaken about certain values that they might profess. Now, social scientists don't deal with those questions, but philosophers do. And so what we have here is a difference, I think, between a social scientific viewpoint, which looks at takes what people think as a given and tries to understand that in the holistic context of a culture, and a philosophical question, which is based on the assumption, well, it raises the question, the philosophical approach raises the question, yes, they think it, but ought they to think that? Is that really true? And the relativist, in the philosophical sense, says, well, we really don't have to deal with that problem, or that problem is unanswerable. The question, ought they to think that? People simply think these things. There are no truths on these matters. We just simply have to live and let live. The samurai in medieval Japan, when they got a new sword, what they would do is they'd go and wait at the crossroads, and they would try and chop in two the first person that came their way. And Mary Midgley has a wonderful book, Attacking Moral Relativism, and this is the first example she uses, you know. In the time and place and the culture, that was a perfectly sensible act. But then the question is, yes, but was it right, even though it made sense in the cultural context of medieval Japan? But was it right? Now, you're right that there are certain things, conventions play a role. For instance, if you're going to have roads and you're going to go two directions, we need to have conventions to assign which direction you go on which side of the road. Even that is terribly constrained by objective circumstances, right? There's to and fro, and you can't be in two places at the same time, and it doesn't really matter which side you choose as long as you stick with it. There are conventions that are necessary, but they're necessitated by things that are very objective, and they're not necessarily merely arbitrary, in the sense that you can just sort of say, well, you know, I've decided that I'm going to get myself completely perforated and tattooed, and that's going to make me happy. And, you know, and then 10 years later, you've thrown away all your unfashionable clothes from 10 years ago, but my God, what do you do about all these now unfashionable perforations and tattoos? Put it this way, it might be a terrible mistake to make one of these sort of arbitrary claims that kids today like to make, that this will make them happy, and because it might turn out that they won't. And if that's the case, then there's got to be something more to simply making the choice to the pursuit of happiness or the pursuit of the good. There must be standards. Yeah, but could it be that some cultures are mistaken and others aren't? I mean, that's the issue. Well, it would have to mean that it's objective. It's not a question of who on this account. It's a question of what, and that would be nature. Nature is not an authority figure. We all think that we're doing the right thing. We all mean well, but the thing is, can't we be radically and terribly mistaken? The issue is that there are millions and billions, or we're approaching 6 billion now, right? There are millions and billions of people on this planet, all of whom, given a certain amount of time and a certain age and experience, will construct very, very carefully in their minds a sense that what they're doing is the right thing. That's just the logic of human action. We all have some reason for what we do, and we all pursue things under the guise of the good. But so many of us are suffering. And isn't that a sign that maybe our opinions about what brings us happiness aren't true, and that there's a right answer that we need to search for? If there is a right answer, then it pays us all to search for it. If there is no right answer, then we don't need to do anything. We can just sort of sit around, because, again, we might not be lost. We're found. Wherever we are is where we ought to be. If that's what the relativist says. Wherever you are is where you ought to be, because there are no standards for saying that you're not there. But clearly human suffering and human happiness are real. And what they're telling us, perhaps, is that there's an objective order of things. Now that objective order of things can be individualized down to the last atom, in the sense that we have a destiny to fulfill that's our own, that there's a true self that needs to come out. But there are also more general truths about happiness and unhappiness that are true of all of us as members of the human race. If there are these truths, then there are also falsehoods out there that appear to be true but aren't. The falsehoods lead us to unhappiness, and the truths lead us to happiness. That's the sense of this. And if that viewpoint can't be defended, then the activity of philosophy as such is totally worthless.